Hi, we're Paul and Vicki Jenkins. As a professional psychologist, I get this question: how do I think up appropriate consequences for my school-age child?
We're going to start with the psychology first, and then we'll give you some practical ideas and some great tips.
Including some tools that you can take home with you. We've developed a psychological model that will help us to understand what we're going to do with the consequences. And it starts with control and maturity. When we understand how these two things work together, it changes the game for us as parents. So let's start with control, meaning control over your own life. It goes from 0 down here at the bottom to 100% up here on the top. So you can have all of the control or none of the control or somewhere in between. Now, this is true for you as well as for your kids. Keep that in mind as well. Now down here we have maturity. The most common way we think about maturity is age. So starting over here, let's say that this side of the maturity scale is birth. How much control do you have over your own life at birth? Yeah, hardly any. It's way down here. You can make a big noise and a big stink, but that's about it. What's at the other end? Let's say that this is adulthood over here on this end of the maturity scale. How much control do you have over your own life as an adult? Now, here's where you're going to kick into some of the fine print, okay? But when I ask teenagers this question, how much control do the adults have? They're like, oh, 100%. So let's just go with what they're saying and put it up here toward the top. So between birth and adulthood, as we become more mature, we get to have more and more control over our own life. Now, as we draw that line, the part of the control under the line is self-control, and the part over the line is the part others take. Others like who? Well, parents, for example. There has to be 100% control. The only question is who's going to take it.
Right, because maturity isn't directly related to age. There are other factors we have to consider.
We all know adults who are pretty immature.
Right.
And kids who are pretty precocious.
And think about it. When somebody is acting immature, what do we say? You are out of control, right? When they're not in control of their faculties.
So let's look at not just age, but stage. So going back to our model, if we divide this whole model into 3 stages, let's just draw some lines here indicating 3 different stages. And I took some time to think up the names for these. I call this one stage 1. I know, right? Brilliant. This one is stage 2. Are you with me? Can you see where we're going? This one is stage 3. And that's simple, but we find that people can remember it.
Right.
So that's kind of awesome. Now, let's look at what each of these stages represent. In stage 1, we are selfish and self-centered, and we yell and scream, or we demand, or we manipulate, or we throw tantrums. Does this sound familiar? And that's typical of a 2-year-old. Okay? It's age typical, it's developmentally appropriate for a 2-year-old to throw a tantrum. But we know that teenagers can do it too. Okay, so that's stage 1. Now when we move to stage 2, oh, and look, at stage 1, you don't get very much control for yourself. Somebody else is stepping in and taking most of the control. That's going to be important when we get back to the consequences. When we move to stage 2, we stop fighting and start cooperating. Okay, we don't want any trouble, we want to keep the peace, so we go along with reasonable requests. We try to help out where we can. There's kind of a, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. We can negotiate. That's stage 2. You get to have more control at stage 2. And the people up here on the top, the parents, don't have to take as much control. Stage 3, oh, that's a thing of beauty. Okay? This is all about responsibility and empathy and service and doing the right things for the right reasons and taking initiative, seeing what needs to be done and just doing it. That's stage 3. People typically don't come to the office and ask for help with that one. because it's all about self-control at that point. So with those stages in mind, let's get back to the consequences.
It's really helpful to think about consequences in two different categories, those that require cooperation and those that don't. Remember, when we're in stage one, when a child is in stage one, they are not cooperating. They're being selfish, they're being self-centered, they're throwing tantrums, and this could be any age, right? So even a 16-year-old that's acting that way, you don't want to give a consequence that requires cooperation because you don't have their cooperation right now, right? If you get into stage two, the dividing line of stage two is the willingness to cooperate. As soon as your child is willing to cooperate, they're in stage two, and now your consequences can require some cooperation.
This is the part that's usually easy. Right. Think about it. When your kids are cooperating with you, you're not pulling your hair out.
Right.
You're coming up with some consequences. You tell them to do this thing that is the consequence, and they're like, okay, fine, and they go do it.
Right.
The place where we run into trouble is when our kids refuse to cooperate. And that's where we find parents getting frustrated. That's when we start yelling and screaming, and that's not helpful, by the way. What we need to do is have consequences that do not require cooperation, because you don't get it until stage two.
Right. And for whatever reason, this is really hard in the moment because usually your emotions are involved when the kid isn't cooperating. A lot of times it's at the grocery store and they're just throwing a fit, right? And so we want it to be helpful to you and give you some ideas of consequences that do not require any cooperation from your child.
Look, you don't have to figure out what all those consequences could or might be. We've got your back on this. Go to the URL that's shown there, drpauljenkins.com/consequences, and that's going to get you right into a whole list that we've already created for you. You don't have to do all of the thinking on your own. So just tell us where to send it. We'll get it into your hands. Now let's give a couple of examples of what we're talking about. So a consequence, a typical consequence that requires cooperation is to go to your room, okay, or go to timeout. Now, I have to make an acknowledgement here that it may depend on the age of your child at this point too.
Right.
Because if you're talking about a 3-year-old, you can physically escort them to the timeout chair.
Right.
If we're talking about a 17-year-old who outweighs you by 30 pounds, probably not so much.
Right.
So that would require cooperation from the teenager, but not necessarily from the toddler. Here's another one that I enjoy. Giving them an essay assignment. Okay? I want you to write a 3-page essay about what principle was violated and what your commitment is in the future.
Now you're going to need cooperation for that one, right?
Obviously. Because they can wad that paper up and throw it back in your face. I'm not going to do your stupid essay. All right? So that obviously requires cooperation. Well, what's an example of one that would not require cooperation? For a teenager, for example. How about access to my vehicle?
Including a ride. Not just driving it, but maybe a ride.
The key here is, what do I control? What can I enforce 100%? Whether or not I have cooperation or buy-in or agreement. And that's the key. So as we're coming up with those consequences that don't require cooperation, all we have to get clear about is, what can we control? What do we control?
Stage 2 is kind of fun because in stage 2, your consequences are things that require cooperation. But if you have a child who's cooperating with you, you can even sit down and talk about the consequence together.
Yes.
And then there's a little buy-in from them because they'll see maybe a principle that was violated and they can see the reason why that's important not to violate that particular principle or family rule. And you can talk about what they would feel would be a consequence. And so it's nice. You have some cooperation there. I am going to say one caveat. Remember, stage 2, here's the kid says, fine, I'll go do the dishes, and storms off. Now, a lot of times you that might trigger you and think, you're not being mature. But remember, they are cooperating. They are walking over the dishes.
Key.
Yeah. And so they might be just kind of barely in stage 2, but they are in stage 2. And so just kind of keep your mind set. You're not asking for stage 3 and demanding stage 3. If they're in stage 2, let's meet them in stage 2 and have some cooperation and accept the amount of cooperation they're giving you and make a consequence that fits that amount of cooperation.
We're going to meet them in whatever stage they're in. And this is where parents get frustrated sometimes when their kids are on stage 1, but they really want them to be on stage 2. Well, you don't get to decide what stage your kid's on. Your kids decide that. They control that. So we just need to be able to correctly discern what stage they're on so that we come in with the right level of control. And as far as the consequences, either they're consequences that don't require cooperation, which we're doing at stage 1, or they are consequences that may require cooperation and often do require cooperation. I love, Vicki, that you pointed out also that communication is part of stage 2. So you can engage with them to get their ideas about it. That's a powerful intervention. You don't have to do this alone. Obviously, we've got your back. Get that list of consequences that we shared with you earlier, drpauljenkins.com/consequences. There are other people too who are forming communities and support groups and conversations that are happening all over the place where you can get other ideas from other parents. Engage with your community. Talk to your friends. Talk to other parents. Share this video with them so that we can together come up with more ideas about how we can do this more effectively. Hey, we were serious about it when we said we've got your back. In fact, we've got another video for you to watch. It's about 5 powerful secrets for teaching children responsibility. Cue that one up next, and like I said, share it with other people who you know would appreciate it.